Good day, everybody. This is a very auspicious event because we're lucky and honoured to have Sanjeev Sabhlok with us, who some of you may know, but Sanjeev was very senior in the Victorian Treasury in Australia, and he's an economic doctor and actually got his doctorate in Southern Californian University of Southern California. A very astute, intelligent person who analysed what was happening with this COVID situation, lockdown, and came up with some very clear statements that it's completely wrong. It's complete, very poor policy, and he was so honourable that he resigned from his position when the government wouldn't listen. So we're lucky to have Sanjeev with us, and what we want to do is ask Sanjeev some of the reasons and rationales that he believes in. He's actually put a case into the ICC now. He's writing books, he's written books, which Sanjeev can tell you about, and I think that he's one of our Australian heroes. One person who stood up, in the face of adversity to tell the truth. Now, on my side, I'm a much smaller person than Sanjeev in that sense. I'm just a retiree, but I stood up, and I've been arrested twice by the police, and I've been charged with alleged criminal indictments against the Chief Health Minister of Victoria. So we both, if I may say, we both stood up, but in very different ways. And our approach, I think, is the same in the sense that we are taking all of this very seriously, and we're taking the law of Australia into account. And in Sanjeev's point of view, he's also going overseas to the ICC, and we're standing up to make this thing, to fix this problem. So I'll let Sanjeev speak. He's got a lot to say, and he's got very clear statements and ideas. Sanjeev.
Thank you, Sol, for having me. I think I'm trying to get out of my home, so I thought I'll come and have a chat with you personally. It's been quite stuck inside my home for a long time. The point you made about my resigning, I think it's an important milestone for me. This was my second resignation in my life from a government position. My first resignation was from a very senior role in the Indian government, and I resigned because I disagreed with the way the Indian governments are operating in a socialist model with a lot of corruption. And I was very happy here in Victoria. And I thought it is one of the world's best governments, and I keep arguing this is one of the world's best treasuries. I was very happy with my job. I was enjoying it. I was learning a lot. I had some concerns about some policies and some politicians and so on, but having said that, nothing was significant enough for me to then raise my voice and to then resign. But once the COVID policies were adopted in Victoria in the end of March, I became really concerned that this is simply inconsistent with what I've been always advocating and recommending. And in fact, in February this year, I provided an email trail to my senior bosses, explaining to them that in this particular case, we can see very clearly from the data coming in from Wuhan that it affects the very elderly much more than the others. In fact, that is so now much more evident and obvious everywhere in the world that virtually no one below the age of 50 has ever been affected. So we're sort of seeing clear trends in February itself, and I had sent out an email, which I will then publish once I get the email from the FOI, that Freedom of Information request I've lodged, where I said that we need an age-based risk management model. And what does it mean? It means that, like in every other thing we manage in life, we manage dangerous goods. We do not stop the whole world just because there is a dangerous good that is passing by in a truck, or is going to a factory, or there's a major hazards facility. We don't shut down the world for that. We don't shut down lockdown societies for anything. What we do is we manage, risk-based way. That's called risk management. And I had a very strong background in risk management as well. apart from economic policy. So I basically was suggesting that people below the age of 40 need to do absolutely nothing. There's no change required in their behavior except washing hands and so on. Provide plenty of sanitizers and so on. But for people between 40 and 60, I suggested that if they are, in a public transport or something, let them wear masks, and in a congested place, let them do that. And people above the age of 60 then can stay and work from home. That is a pretty straightforward first cut analysis of the policy response that we would expect. But there was no question, and I wrote specifically in my emails that we do not want to follow the models of Wuhan, China, and Italy. We don't want to lock down Victoria. And I wrote that in the end of February this year, well before these lockdowns came into effect. But we did have lockdowns here, and I've given the complete description of what might have happened, and I'm still discovering more about it. But there's a kind of a sequence of events that happened, and I've described it in my book, which I wrote after resigning, called The Great Hysteria and the Broken State. So that book shows that, first of all, we had the Wuhan lockdowns, which are completely illegal. They never happened before. The World Health Organization representative in China said, we never saw, this is not recommendation of the World Health Organization. We never ever suggested lockdowns for any of these things. Even border restrictions have to be very limited. Then came Italy, and then in Italy we saw some of these Chinese people going and trying to influence the Italians, and then we saw the Neil Ferguson's model of the 16th of March, which led to a lot of hysteria in the media. The net result of all this was that by end of March, Victoria was implementing the same lockdowns that were implemented in Wuhan. In fact, we ultimately implemented much stronger, in many ways, stronger lockdowns than the ones in Wuhan, with curfews, 5-kilometer limits, and people can't get out of the house for 23 hours a day and whatnot. So the approach here was so contrary to risk-based approaches that I work in regulatory policy. That has been my main area in the Treasury. And I advise on a number of issues, including urban planning, local government, and I had earlier advice on energy policy, forestry, and agriculture. But in each case, we take the lens of risk management. We want regulation or a government intervention to be risk-based, to be proportionate. These are very critical words. They mean a lot, and they're actually embedded in all our laws, including, by the way, in the Public Health Act, including the Biosecurity Act. And this test of proportionality is the crucial test. It's got to be evidence-based. You've got to prove that this was required. What we're doing here in this case of lockdowns was very obvious, that we are trying to target those who are not at risk. So people who are very young, they will have no risk whatsoever. People below the age of 50, but a little bit of risk. We sort of could have just given them some better advice. And we could have taken a lot of care of our elderly. People above the age of 75, 80, 85, etc. We could have taken a lot more care of them. And like all other, pandemics, this would have passed in 6 to 8 weeks. This is a standard transmission rule of all these pandemics, that they come and go very quickly. But if you drag them on forever, like we've done now, we really don't know when they're going to end. And if you notice, by the way, this 6-week or 7-week, 8-week point that I make, if you look at the data of Europe and in the USA, you'll notice there was a sudden peak from the end of mid-March up till mid-April, and then it faded out. And so we see the same 6 to 8 week pattern everywhere in the world, even for this particular pandemic. There are many other issues. I'll come to that. But the reason I had to resign was that not just the bad policies, which I was raising within my department, and I didn't need to resign to do that. But I raised concerns, and I called Victoria Police State once the police was deployed to go and bash up people. In fact, they were arresting people. They were...
Me being one.
There you are. And there were many others, and then they were beating them up. One was forced to go into induced coma in the ICU. I thought this was very, very bad for a developed country to operate like Nazi Germany effectively. The brown shirts, the police had become the brown shirts. They were beating up our own people. And we became a Chinese dictatorship of some sort, worse than China in a way. We lost our moral authority the day our police went and beat up people for what? Not for crimes, but for not wearing a mask. And these were young people, most of them.
Political views.
And for political views as well. So what we immediately did We started on a bad note in end of March, but by I think it was mid-July, we started becoming a totalitarian society. And to me, that is not a good look. I do not wish to sit down and keep my mouth shut. I've opened my mouth and I've left my job in India because it had many elements of this police brutality in India. And so when I speak for human rights, I actually mean that. I do not tolerate the idea of a government hitting a sovereign citizen. The citizen who pays the salaries of the police, that man or woman deserves a respect. And
in fact, they work for us.
They are our servants, and I keep arguing again and again. The government is our servant. We pay for their salaries. They are required to respect us as sovereign, and they will only use the minimal force when absolutely necessary to prevent harm from somebody else. But here's somebody walking on a road, not actually harming anybody around, and doesn't have a mask. I won't go to the technical side of the mask being totally useless outdoors, which is what the facts are. But let's say there's a law and somebody's going out there, and you don't expect the police to start beating them up. And so when I started protesting this on social media, I was asked to remove my criticisms of the sort. And I decided at that point that this is not tenable anymore. Despite my love for economics and my love for policy advice and my job, which I needed for at least a few more years before I finally retired, I decided the time had come for me to actually step out and to escalate rather than to de-escalate and to keep my mouth shut. I thought the time has come for me to defend the Victorians' right as sovereign citizens and my own right as a sovereign citizen to actually insist that I will not live in a totalitarian state. If required, I will come out and fight till the very end, but I will not allow my country, and I'm an Australian citizen, I will not allow Australia to deteriorate into a communist, terrorist, totalitarian society. And with that determination, I came out, wrote the Fin Review article immediately. That was accepted and published. I think I resigned on the 9th of September. On the 16th of September, this article came out and led to a lot of media flurry, interviews in the media. And the mainstream media, by the way, Channel 7, interviewed me on the 17th. But I'm told now quite clearly that their senior management basically censored my interview. So my interview was not allowed to be put out by the Channel 7, although later in a separate interview on their Sunrise whatever show, I did get a few minutes to speak. But on Channel 9, they came to my home and did an interview. So I wouldn't say that the mainstream media has censored me, but I would definitely say that Channel 7 has censored me. And I think this really reflects very poorly on them. I spent 2 hours of my time actually going to my office. They took me in my office area. They did all the pictures. So that was a very unfortunate situation. But the media in general, Sky News, etc., covered me quite well. Alan Jones, wrote about my article. So this led to a number of ways of communicating my message. And one of the things that happened as a result was an offer from Corner Court Publishing that said, "Hey, Guy, do you want to write a book about this?" I said, "Yeah, okay, let me have think about this." And I had been writing a lot of articles. Now, I work part-time in the Treasury, and for the rest of my time, which is private time, I have been focusing on developing a political party in India called Swarn Bharat Party, the Golden India Party, which is India's liberal party. And it's the only liberal party of India. So I've been developing it for the last 20 years of my life. And I've got a blog on Times of India, which is the world's largest English newspaper. And I can publish whenever I want on that blog. I wrote 17 articles on this issue from the policy perspective, but focused on India. And so I took all that material and I had some further material and I got information from the social media. By the way, I got a phenomenal amount of input from social media, including many, many supportive messages. So that was really helpful to get all this support, as well as the information flow about, here's the law that's been breached. This has happened, that's happened. I wasn't fully on top of everything, but I was able to then take that material. One lady, Alexandra Chapman from Macedon, she was kind enough to actually help in editing, like proofing, because I had very little time. She volunteered and she helped. So I managed to get this book out within just 10 days. In 10 days, I wrote a book because I had this background of 17 articles. And then I had this new information. So I managed to finish this book, The Great Hysteria and the Broken State, published early October. You can imagine, virtually within 15 days of my coming out, there was a book on the streets.
It's incredible.
Okay?
It's incredible.
In addition to my film review article. And that book led to me to have further thoughts. One of the big things that came up, Saul, was that I was earlier looking at this perspective from the economic policy perspective, the regulatory policy perspective, the risk management perspective, and all that I spoke about. But over the course of writing the book and the material that I received, including somebody sending me that, hey, this breaches the Nuremberg Code. Now, I had never heard of that code in my life, and so on. So because so much information came in, then I actually said, okay, hey, this sounds like a crime against humanity. This is not simply a breach of the laws. The fact that there are a lot of people, because a lot of reports had already come in from across the world about people who are scared stiff by this hysteria and the government lockdowns to not get themselves checked for cancer, or even go for a serious heart problem, and many of them died at home. Now, those deaths which were caused by the lockdowns, and there were some evidence,
and the suicides.
And suicide, but although that suicide data wasn't very strong, but there was some evidence of suicide data in India. The net result was that there were a lot of these deaths happening and a lot of lives being shortened across the world because of lack of healthcare for 6 months in many countries. And so that data was persuading me, along with this fact that this was really inappropriate from many angles. And so I researched some more. I went and did some research on the original pandemic plans, not only of Victoria, but of which I wrote about in my book, which was, by the way, quite consistent with the standard laws and would never have led to this situation, which was talking about flattening the curve and not eradicating the virus, which is what they were doing here, by comparing the plans from across the world. And I was in touch with people like Martin Kulldorff. Martin Kulldorff is a Harvard Medical School professor who's been very supportive of my work from the very beginning. Because I write a lot in Times of India and other places, and I get supportive emails from people. And he used to support my work from the very beginning. And he turned out to be the one who co-signed the Great Barrington Declaration. So I was seeing a lot of good people telling me that I'm on the right track. And so with that information coming in from people like him from everywhere, I finally wrote this complaint to the International Criminal Court.
Could you tell people about the Great Barrington?
The Great Barrington Declaration is one of the very best pieces of medical advice on this issue that you can get. It is co-authored by 3 of the world's best epidemiologists. One is Sunetra Gupta, who is the professor of theoretical epidemiology at the Oxford University, and one is Jay Bhattacharya, who is the professor of epidemiology at Stanford, and then we have Martin Kulldorff, I've mentioned, so from Harvard. Now, these 3 who are the stalwarts in their discipline came out of just roughly the same time as I published my book. Actually, they came out with this Great Barrington Declaration, and it's a short declaration of about I think 10 or 15 paragraphs, but has now been signed by around 40,000 professionals, medical professionals from all the world. And basically says that the approach being taken is completely inconsistent with medical science. Basically, the lockdowns are not consistent. And instead, you need to take an age-based approach, which is the similar one to what I've actually written. My first article on this issue, written on the 6th of March, 2020, in the Times of India, was about the age-based risk management of this pandemic. That is exactly what the Great Barrington Declaration says in the month of, I think, early October or late September. It is exactly the same thing. That's what Martin Kulldorff has been saying as well. So when all these people, and I'm coming from the economic and risk management perspective, and these guys are coming from the medical perspective, and all these pandemic plans are also saying the same thing. There is not a single pandemic plan anywhere in the world that says we will lock down for a flu-like virus. So what we saw here, I get back to the ICC complaint. All that information then flowed into this 68,000 piece of work, 68,000 words piece of work, which took me 20 days non-stop. Like 10 days I wrote for the book, 20 days I wrote for this one. Basically, I didn't sleep in most of these writing times. I worked 14 hours a day. finished this work. This one I had some support from here and there, but not like Alexandra Chapman, who was phenomenal for the book, but therefore it's not very well proofread. But I got really tired after so much of work, and I just finished it on the 13th of November and lodged it. I could have improved it, and I intend to improve it through supplementary submission. This particular thing is freely available. And the reason I wrote it is not just for myself and for the ICC, but for everyone to read. It is freely available on my blog. I think about 2,000 people have downloaded from my blog, but in addition, I've seen that a few thousand people have circulated it. A few thousand copies have been circulated on the internet, on the internet by others. I would strongly encourage people to read that because it gives you the complete story. For example, did you know that lockdowns are not recommended even for Ebola? The only time they were tried in the last 500 years. The first time there was during the plague. But in the last 500 years, the next time they were tried was only for Ebola in Africa. And they were tried in twice.
This could be an interesting time to bring in the law in Australia because you've taken it to the ICC.
Yes.
I'm working with a group of very astute people with legal knowledge, and we believe that many of these lockdown issues are completely illegal.
Absolutely.
And particularly through the Constitution and the Biosecurity Act.
Yes.
And there are other acts.
They've breached all the laws. Let me just say that they have breached all the laws.
So I just want to make that point that for anyone who's watching, that we are taking action in Australia through the courts and through law and through our Constitution, which actually is very powerful and gives us a lot of rights. And this is happening right now, so expect to hear something soon.
Yeah, unfortunately, as you know, Saul, the two cases that went to the courts in Australia, they were unfortunately unsuccessful. The High Court case by Clive Palmer against the border closure by Western Australia, which is completely illegal. That was found by the courts, the High Court, to be legal, which is really astonishing. And the second was this curfew declaration was found to be valid by the Victorian Supreme Court. I believe that the cases must have been prepared shoddily because there is no basis possible for such arguments to succeed in the court because there is such an obvious, clear and comprehensive breach of Australia's laws and all the relevant international covenants that Australia is a signatory of. Australia cannot simply sit out there and create new such restrictions on its own. When I'm sort of so I think what we've seen is that from the policy perspective this was wrong, but my gut feel that this is wrong has also been confirmed, as you rightly said, through the legal analysis. The more and more you look at the laws, the public health law itself has been breached in innumerable ways. The arguments made by the Chief Health Officer in his memorandum of the 15th of March and I think the 11th of September, these two memos were lodged in the Parliament. They're absolutely speculative. They're absolutely imaginary and can be disposed of they are trite, irrelevant, not evidence based. They are speculative. For him, it appears that the models are evidence, but Mr. Brett Sutton is not aware, and I think the parliamentarians of Victoria seem to be not aware that models are not science. That models are mathematics. Mathematics is not science. Science is about evidence. Science is about telling us. So it tells us, so the idea was that we would flatten the curve. So then tell us how many people were there in the ICU. We have 650 beds, ICU beds in Victoria. How many of them were actually occupied by these corona victims at any given point in time? That evidence was never provided. Instead, all that Mr. Sutton does is to provide some claims from these various models. And the models are complete nonsense. And I think the Supreme Court of Victoria was offered these models as proof of the need for the curfew, which is the biggest pile of rubbish in the world, because what the court needed to ask was, has there ever been any peer-reviewed journal publication in the history of the world which proves that curfew can actually kill the virus and eradicate the virus? Is there any such publication anywhere in the world that the flu-like virus can be killed, eradicated from the planet Earth by having a curfew? And no, they didn't ask that. And somehow the courts, the legal side, did not provide that question. What is this? All that is provided by the government defense was, hey, we have this model, and so it was very, very serious. It could have become very serious, if we didn't do the curfew. But that's not called science. That's speculation. That's not how you do risk management. That's not how you do proportionality. So what I'm saying is the proportionality and the risk management approaches that I've been talking about are very deeply embedded within the laws. And it is those laws that have been breached. The biosecurity one is very critical here, because the biosecurity one says, thou shalt not eradicate a virus or a pathogen. And I'm simplifying the language there. But what it's basically saying is Australia should take action against any pathogen, a red ant or another invasion.
And at an individual level.
Yes, and those are the quarantine orders you mentioned. Yeah. Yes, that's fine, biosecurity. But what I'm saying is that the pathogen, the focus of the government in Victoria, in Australia, on biosecurity is that we will minimize the pathogen in Australia. We will not eradicate it. That is actually a prohibition inside the Biosecurity Act. So when we look at these guys saying we'll flatten the curve, but then they offer evidence that, we're basically eradicating the virus. What are they doing? They're not only doing the proportionality wrong, which is they're doing speculation rather than evidence. They're also breaching the Biosecurity Act. So what I'm trying to say here, Saul, that these guys have breached all the laws of Australia. Yeah. And that is a very serious misdemeanor. And I think there needs to be somebody to bring them to account.
Yeah, and I with the 3 cases that have been run, my personal opinion is that the plaintiff arguments are incredibly weak. And they've been asking the wrong questions of the government. So we're going to stand up, we're going to put cases into the courts, all of them, including the High Court, to prove that this is absolute nonsense.
Yeah, look, I personally have no capacity or resources or whatever to get involved in legal matters, except writing my complaint to the ICC, and I will send a supplementary submission. But by all means, use the ICC complaint, because it has a very detailed analysis of the law from all possible angles. It has looked at it from the policy angle, from the historical angle of the virus pandemics. It's looked at it from the angle of the breach of the Biosecurity Act, the Public Health Act, the international covenants. Each of these is a full-fledged breach. Therefore, I'm very confident, by the way, that the International Criminal Court there are 2 stages required before it actually takes action. The first is a preliminary examination, it's called, preliminary examination. And that's what's happening at the moment. They've acknowledged the complaint has been received. Now they will undertake that particular preliminary examination. If it passes that, then they will start an investigation. The prosecutor. So this is to the prosecutor of the ICC, not the court. The prosecutor has to determine whether there is sufficient basis. In my view, it will pass the first test. Once it passes the first test, there will be a formal investigation. That will be a very big deal. If it happens, they can do it themselves, the investigation, or they can pass it back to the courts of Australia. The High Court and Victoria Supreme Court are competent under the Rome Statute to investigate matters on behalf of the prosecutor. We as Australians pay for the salaries of the ICC. In addition, of course, there are some not-for-profit agencies which contribute, but really it's the joint, the money for the ICC, the court, criminal court, is contributed by the members. And it has got a choice of actually, as I said, passing it back to the High Court of Australia. I've also sent a copy of my complaint to the High Court of Australia and to the Supreme Court of Victoria. The Supreme Court of Victoria simply said, sorry, you need to follow a certain process, which appears that they do not really believe that 68,000 word document is sufficient, to start a process on their own. It seems that they are very much process oriented, and I do not have the luxury of time to go and doing their processes. But the High Court has not yet responded to my copy of the complaint that I sent on the 13th or 14th of November.
Well, we have access to this court.
Right. So you could use that complaint you could just formally lodge the complaint with these courts. That's itself a good process, because that complaint contains a comprehensive demolition of the approaches being taken here, including the border control. Like I said, Scott Morrison thinks that we are his private fish, so he can, we are his private fish pond. He can lock up us in Australia. This is simply a breach of all possible human rights that you can possibly
And the Constitution.
and the Constitution and the Biosecurity Act and everything in the world. So Scott Morrison's approach here, which is now being converted into a saying, okay, we are not going to mandate the vaccine, but we'll force you to come and have a quarantine when you come into the country. But sorry, you can't do that, sir. This is completely wrong, because you need to, as you rightly said, an individual biosecurity order based on the specific threat that an individual provides. You can't just make a general rule that everybody coming here is to be quarantined. That's not the way the laws work in Australia. The other point I've come to, which is the third point after my resignation, was a recent research which I've published just about a week ago, was analysis of the Sweden total deaths data. This is really, really, really important. This actually is probably the biggest issue that I have come across. For the last few months, I've been reading here and there that the total deaths in Sweden have not been changing too much from the previous year's deaths. That's the data that's floating around on the internet. I didn't have time to really look into that. I alluded to some of the evidence of that sort from using Statistica or whatever that is, the website which contains some data. I used that and provided some preliminary data to the ICC. But then I had some more time, and when I looked at the data myself, I've actually concluded quite clearly that although Sweden has currently got allegedly 6,500 deaths, COVID deaths. Now these, by the way, remember, COVID deaths are not necessarily from COVID. They can be with COVID. Okay, so let's keep that in mind, that when we have any COVID death, it's not necessarily...
Well, in Victoria, it's 9% were without comorbidity.
Yes. So we know very clearly that COVID deaths are not proof. So the first thing I write in my article in the Times of India, which is written on just last week or so, is that the fact that something is a COVID death, is declared a COVID death, does not make it a COVID death. The only way to know whether this pandemic actually was a serious pandemic is to look at the total deaths in a country which did not stop its spread. All the countries that tried to stop its spread here and there are not relevant here. What is relevant is a country like Sweden, which said we will not control its spread. We will simply ask you to social distance, look after yourself, and let the virus spread slowly. We'll look after the elderly. Okay? And in that case, what are the numbers telling us? The numbers are telling us that around 2,500 deaths more than 2018. So 2018 was 91,185 deaths in Sweden. In 2020, we are expecting around 2,500 more.
It's just a statistical error.
But here's the interesting thing, a more interesting thing is that 2018 was a bad flu year. Okay, what happened then? Because in the bad flu year, the next year, the number of deaths declined because a lot of people died in that year. So in 2019, there were 3,500 fewer deaths. But among those, because it's a less deadly flu year, 2019, that also means a lot of people who would have otherwise died did not die. So it's like a fruit that's almost ripe. I'm not telling people, calling people fruits, okay? Let's not go there. But what I'm saying is, imagine a small shake of the wind and the fruit drops.
Yes.
So let's say in 2019, the flu, which was supposed to come, didn't really happen that badly. And so some people who would have otherwise died didn't die. Now, they would have died anyway in 2020.
Yes.
So 2020 would have seen a higher rate of death in Sweden anyway. So despite the COVID 6,500, why do we have only 2,500 extra deaths compared to the previous 2018? Yeah. And the answer to that here, Saul, is very important, because it's telling me that this pandemic does not meet the definition of a pandemic.
Yeah.
A pandemic should not only be spreading across the world, it should also be sufficiently lethal. This one is, if it's hardly out of 1991, 92,000, if it's only killing 2,500 extra, that too after a year when there was no flu practically in 2019, and so a lot of people have died. What are we saying? We are not able to see the signature, what I call the signature of this pandemic.
Yes.
I'm unable to identify in the data, and this is my own analysis. It's available on my website, the original spreadsheets that I've used. I cannot identify all the evidence for this being a pandemic.
Yeah. Well, I might add that there's a great deal of scientific evidence, and I'm a scientist, right, of the non-veracity of all these supposed scientific statements about this COVID. And to my knowledge, the SARS-CoV-2 virus has never been scientifically isolated. The disease, COVID, has never been scientifically defined. It's basically colds and flu. And the PCR test is not at all appropriate for testing for this virus. And that is being tested in the courts right now in Europe, particularly in Germany. They've already had cases, one case in Portugal, which has thrown out the PCR test. And, you know, it's time now that we all stand up and we see that this is a total farce. It's been handled in a shockingly terrible and completely wrong way. And we, the people of Australia, need to stand up and tell our governments that this is the case. And I'd like to just give you some opportunity, Sanjeev, to close maybe some closing remarks. But you know, I really thank you for your making yourself available for us. And let's stand up, Australia.
Yeah. So, Sol, in conclusion, all I'd say is that the people who have gone quite hysterical, and I think probably rightly so. I myself remember a time in mid-March when I was starting to, worry about this particular virus and, all that extra stuff that we were supposed to do. But I'm driven by data, I'm driven by evidence, and I think everyone should be. We should always use our reason. So what I'd suggest is anyone listening, please do not take me at face value. The one rule of science is do not trust anyone. Do not ever trust me, for God's sake. Please trust only yourself. And the only way to do that is to go and check the facts yourself. Read the complaint. I've got about 250 references, original references to the original sources. They are official documents in most cases. They are published, peer-reviewed publications. Also do the analysis that I've done, like the Swedish analysis. It's on my website. Go and do it for yourself. Check the data yourself. And once you've done that yourself, form your own view whether this is a big deal, and also determine whether the politicians have failed you. I believe the politicians of Australia have failed us all in a very big way. I believe a completely new set of politicians is needed. These politicians, I think people should wake up, and then they should come forward and actually change these politicians completely. So we have people who are actually using their brain all the time rather than getting hysterical, like we've seen in this particular case.
Yeah. Well, Sanjeev, thank you so much, and we will make sure that your work is tabled in all the courts of Australia, and certainly the Supreme Court and High Court of Australia. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sol. Yeah. Thank you.